We were supposed to be rescuers. We were supposed to move in, clear a washout, check houses along the hollow, and shepherd a handful of folks and their animals out to a safer road. Instead, by the time we hit the creek, the world smelled wrong. Old metal and wet stone, like a mouth that had been shut for a long time, finally opening. It was April of 2002. I remember the date because we'd been on almost a week of forced evacuations after those upstream slides and the sudden thaw. The call went out at 0100. Sudden rise in the tributary below, several families stranded, power down on the ridge, and the county asked for assistance from the National Guard detachment on standby. We rolled light, 1 infantry platoon, a lieutenant in charge of the corridor, 2 Humvees, a civilian pickup pressed into service with a small utility trailer lashed to it, and me, a sergeant, doing the usual, watching the tail, keeping people moving, counting boots. Our orders were simple, and the night looked straightforward on paper. Get in, verify the route along the creek bank, escort civilians out to the designated staging field 2 clicks north. No heroics, standard operating, move at 0200, eyes on the trail, radios on the prep channel, keep the trailer between the vehicles so it didn't get swamped on the fords. We left the staging site at 0207. That time is in my head like a nail. Lieutenant called it in, Hammer Base, Hammer 1 en route, 0207. We had the low lights, night vision on standby, but the sky was clear, moon half up, the kind of night that shows you your own breath. The hollow was narrow, scrub oak and laurel closing in on the creek like a mouth. The road narrowed to a rutted track, then to only a footpath in places. Trees leaned over the water, and the creek ran slow and dark. Early on, nothing out of place except for the smell. It hit me when I stepped down near the bank to check the footing. An odd metallic tang, and beneath that, an older, colder odor I could only describe as the smell a place carries when it's been undisturbed for generations. My hands still remember it. Damp leather and iron and something ancient. It's hard to explain to people who haven't been around old water. Sometimes a place smells as if it remembers everything that's been thrown into it. We tightened formation and kept moving. The deputy radio operator, Corporal Marks, moved ahead to check a path between rocks. He had a canine team with him at the time. The county had the dog assigned for search. The animal had been restless all evening. You could see it in the way it kept circling the trailer, ears up, tail tucked when the current whispered off the rocks. Then it went from uneasy to outright obsessive, fixating on the waterline, which was unusual. The handler, Green, kept his leash short and hissed for the dog to ignore it. The dog's breathing changed, sharp, staccato, and then it started whining, low, again something that I could feel in my chest more than I heard.
We checked radios as a matter of course. Standard calls, short checks. Lieutenant sounded calm, clipped. Hammer 1 to Hammer Base, movement at 0215, creek route clear to first ford, traffic slow. Base answered, copy Hammer 1, maintain comms, stand by. Nothing odd yet. Then, a sound came off the water. At first I thought some animal on the far bank had exhaled, long, low, as if somebody had let out a lungful and then let it go. It wasn't like a deer's snort, it wasn't like a bear. It was deep and slow and regular, a sound that sat under everything else. The hair went up on the back of my neck. We all froze. The sound had a rhythm, one long exhale, then a pause, almost like someone playing a bass note on an instrument. Corporal Marks looked at me, hand on his radio, eyes saying what we didn't speak aloud. Check it out. He said, weird, you smell that? I did. It was still in the air, pressed into the leaves. Copy, Lieutenant said into the channel. Keep it tight. That's Hammer 1. For a minute we listened. The breathing came again, timed with something in the static of our handsets, little ripples that matched the exhale. I remember thinking how precise it felt, like a bad speaker introducing a track. Corporal Green started making soft noises to keep the dog calm. The handler's voice was thin. Then the tracks. Marks crouched down at the waterline and pointed his flashlight. I shouldn't have, but I walked in on him. The mud had been churned, but not by hooves, not by human boots either. The impressions were plate-sized, oval, and at the tip of each were 3 deep gouges, long and spaced like fingers. The spacing was wrong. They were too wide for a bear. They pointed obliquely, not straight forward, as if whatever made them had pushed its way sideways and pulled something with it. There were also smaller drag marks leading into the water, like a heavy rope had been pulled under the surface. We all looked at each other. The lieutenant's jaw tightened. He called it in. Hammer 1 to Hammer Base. We have large prints at the 0219 mark on the creek bank. Not elk, not bear. Recommend a quick sweep and report. Static came back from base. For the first few seconds it was normal crackle, but layered under it was that same long exhale, faint but there.
The radio aliened that noise, like someone putting its breath to the carrier and letting it ride. Corporal Marks whispered, "Did you hear that under the carrier?" "I heard it," I said. "Copy that," Lieutenant said into the mic. "Hold pattern, maintain visual, no lights." He let the words hang and then quieter. "Green, leash him, now." We moved slow and careful. The civilian pickup with the trailer sat a little ahead, engine idling. Old man Caldwell, local responder, pale and wiry, had been with us since his house near the ford lost power. He'd loaded a few sacks into the trailer earlier, and he kept glancing at the water.
He came up beside the lieutenant and said, low enough only we could hear, "You boys don't want that there after dark. Old stories say it takes what don't belong." He was half joking, half warning. The lieutenant gave him that military half-smile, the kind that means, "We hear you and we appreciate your home truths, but we've got a job." Still, Caldwell's voice had a tremor. We shifted to the other side of the trail to keep the bank between us and the water where possible. That's when the radio glitch worsened. At 02:23, the channel filled with static that sounded like a distant plane. Then, clear as anything, another breath threaded over the carrier. It wasn't the handset squealing. It was layered, deliberate. The lieutenant's fingers tightened on the mic. He called a quick heads-up to base, his voice small with the radio pressed at his mouth. "Base, hammer 1, A0223, something on the channel. Copy?" He cut the mic and we held our breath. The response was delayed. When base came back, it came through with the southern cadence of the county dispatcher, and behind the words, there it was again, that breath in the static. Base replied, "Hammer 1, we copy, but we're getting interference on your frequency. Stand by." Then a pause, then another line. "All units were seeing some unusual activity on repeaters. Advise caution." The lieutenant said, "Roger," but his poise had changed. He fed us a set of hand signals and made us retighten our perimeter. That's when the dog barked like something had hit it. Not a warning bark, an animal scream, a high, keening note that made your teeth sting. Green yanked on the leash and the dog lunged toward the bank, muscles coiling. The handler's words were sharp. The canine snapped back, but the hair along its spine stayed up. Then the water moved. I can still see that movement in my head like an image burned on glass. It wasn't a splash at first. It was a line, a ripple, a long swell that traveled up the creek as if something had exhaled under the rocks. The surface broke at the pace of that exhale. Then, for the time it took a man to blink, a head, big and sloped, rose from the water. It had a snout that was long and blunt, not like any fish I've seen, nor a beaver, nor an otter. The skin gleamed under the moon, scales, not fur, not wet leather, but plates like a river-carved armor. The eyes were the part that stopped my breath, round, reflective like two polished mirrors, catching the weak moon and throwing it back at us with a chill you feel straight down to your molars. It looked at us. There was no ambush, no lumbering mammal charge. It lifted its head as if to measure us, and then exhaled. That sound synced with the radio. The carrier static pulsed with it, and then for a second, it felt like the whole world narrowed to that one audio. The animal, if you can call it that, studied the trailer, the Humvee lights, the dog. Then it moved toward the trailer as if to test a rope.
You never get used to the way something that big can move with such economy. It didn't thrash, it didn't make a mess, it just pulled. The trailer's strap and axle plates sounded like metal adjusting under pressure, and then a soft, sliding scrape, barely audible, like an old zipper being drawn. Where I expected chaos and splashes, there was a slow, calm choreography. The trailer gave a small lurch, and then the water took it. For a terrifying moment, we all watched the thing wrap itself around the trailer, and then, without a wave or a final tantrum, it slipped beneath the surface, and the trailer slid out of sight as if a hand had closed over it. Green went pale. Caldwell shouted, "By God!" I don't remember the rest. The lieutenant barked orders to fall back. In a military situation, you don't get to be sentimental. You move because the situation demands motion. We executed a fighting withdrawal that night, a tight pivot and the sort of practiced calm that shows up only when fear is part of procedure. Our formation tightened and we retraced our steps, but the way things had rearranged along that bank, tracks leading back into the water, a smooth place where something had gone down, left us all feeling small and exposed. Radio went from odd to dead in a matter of minutes. At about 02:29, the carrier dropped. One moment we had the faint breathing over static, the next we had nothing but the hollowness of the channel. Lieutenant tried alternate frequencies.
He cycled the handset through 3 repeats, tried the backup, quit mic checks to avoid overload. Nothing. Static swallowed the channels, or else the signal refused to take. For the first time that night, the only sound was the creak and the dog snuffling, and the living feeling that something was watching us from the dark. We made the decision to pull to the designated staging area, an old fairground field the county had opened up as an assembly point. We moved under tight discipline. No lights, short, sharp commands, arm's-length intervals between us. On the ridge, the county crew had set up minimal lighting and a small generator. People were huddled and shaken, eyes wide, the kind you get when folks had been uprooted from their homes. The lieutenant briefed them the way you brief civilians. Keep low, move when told, don't go near the creek. The county folk looked at us like we were the ones who knew the answers. At the staging area, I did the thing you do after a contact. Inventory. We counted men, kits, and equipment. The pickup was missing its trailer. There was no debris floating downstream at first glance, no obvious pieces that might have broken free. The handler's dog trembled and would not leave Green's side. Someone fetched blankets for the civilians. Lieutenant tried the radio again and again. At 0235, he called into base via the long-range link. And finally, after a delay that felt at scene, we got a voice on the other end confirming our location and asking for a 10-6 report.
The debrief was formal enough, but the language started early to smooth itself. When you speak to a desk sergeant on a clean line, things get compressed. The lieutenant gave times, positions, a terse description. We observed large prints and noted unusual interference on comms. 1 civilian trailer unaccounted for. No injuries reported at this time. The line back to command asked the standard questions. Any casualties? Weapon engagement? Civilian danger? We answered evenly, the way we had been trained. But even in the clean cadence of the debrief, I could feel that something was bending. My chest was still tight from looking into those eyes. The other men moved like they were still counting the beats between exhales. I could see them replaying the motion of the trailer disappearing. Nobody had been pulled under with a sound or a scream. There was no chaos scene, no tangle of limbs. There was a hole in the narrative where one piece of reality had simply been removed. That's when we first got the placating language. Wildlife activity, the county told us over the phone, an attempt to put something that didn't fit into the known box. Later, someone would call it loss due to current in the preliminary report. Those words are like antiseptic. They shut down the parts of you that want to name things. The lieutenant didn't push back. You don't argue with bureaucrats in the middle of a multi-agency incident unless you have to. You give them the data and you let them spin their logic. But privately, in low voices, there were questions. Why no splash? Why no debris? Why did the spill of whatever took that trailer look like a careful removal? We were told to stand down and await a recovery team at first light. We secured perimeters, took shifts, and tried to sleep in the backs of our vehicles. The men were subdued. You could see the tiredness in their faces, not the normal kind you get from a long patrol, but a raw observation. We had brushed up against something, and it had looked back. I wandered over to the county liaison, a man named Peters, who'd been coordinating evac logistics. He was thin, with hair combed so tight it looked brittle. He told me quietly that the old-timers around Sakari had always refused to camp near that bend, that they'd had tales passed down about a thing in the eddy, one that'd take what the water finds. He shrugged as if to wash his hands of superstition, but his thumbs rubbed his forearms. They'll say you woke it, he said in that way people do when they want you to understand and not to ask. They'll tell you should have listened. I didn't laugh. It would have been easy to chalk the old man's words up to folk memory, but when you grow up near water, and I'd spent enough years in rural training zones to know the cadence of local knowledge, you learn that sometimes the stories are warnings shaped by experience, sometimes they're ways of saying, stay away. Twice a year, at minimum, we run into folklore that turns out to be shorthand for real hazards, swift undercurrents, sinkholes, murky eddies. That knowledge is practical, and it's humbling. Still, military instinct is to keep moving. We are problem solvers by habit. We were ordered to document and refrain from spreading panic. Photography was encouraged, but the cold truth is the images came back blurred. The recovery team at dawn found little more than disturbed mud, a faint smear where a strap had darkened the bank, and tracks that the water and wind had already started to erase. Men carried cameras to take what they could, but even the best shots showed only the suggestion of prints, rings in the soft bank, nothing conclusive. The trailer was gone. No human body, no shreds of canvas or metal. The county recorded the trailer as lost to water, and the first shaved-down version of the story in the incident log read like that. I remember the brief looks exchanged in the debrief. The lieutenant asked for a list of witnesses, for a private accounting of observations. I gave my statement in the language of the unit. Times, calls, tracks, the breathing on the radio. I insisted on putting in the detail about the reflective eyes. He wrote it down and nodded. His handwriting was neat and official. But later, in a short conversation that feels like fog on the edges of memory, a civilian-looking man and a woman, both sober in dark coats and too plain to be from the county, showed up at the staging area just after dawn. They asked to speak to the lieutenant alone. I remember how they approached, measured, their questions professional, their tone neutral. They weren't in uniform, but they weren't ordinary folks. They introduced themselves with names that felt like paperwork, no rank, just a badge number, and a polite insistence that we give them the official statement. They asked the right questions, the procedural ones. Who spotted it first? What did you lose? Any photographic evidence? Have you retained the radios? Have you logged times? But in the pauses between scripted questions there was another purpose. They wanted the men's faces, to see who looked defiant and who looked frightened. They wanted anything we had. Lieutenant answered them with the level of candor he could spare, what we observed without editorializing. They listened without blinking. Then, with all the courtesy of bureaucrats who know things that wear the cloak of classified, they said some words that felt like the hinge of the whole night. "We'll need the radios secured," the woman said in a voice that did not invite negotiation. "We'll request the hard copies of the logs and a full list of witnesses. Keep everything to formal channels." The implication hung in the field lights like smoke. They weren't ordering threats. They were pointing to a process that would make the story small and neat. That's where the care of an institution comes in. A smoothing. A containment.
Official channels will say there's a reason for it. Control panic, preserve evidence. But what it means on the ground is you begin to feel what being in the middle of a story that someone else will own is like. Your memories get collected and filed. Your words are summarized. Your fear is sanitized. By 0600, we were a unit that had seen something and had been told to stand ready. The county took possession of the scene for evidence, and the recovery team, with bright vests, came downriver to look for anything that might have floated. Men bearing the odd combination of curiosity and dread fanned out and walked the bank like they were walking over a wound. I tried to speak to Caldwell, the old man whose warnings had been half joke, half lore, but he had slipped off before daylight. He left a note with the county dispatcher. "Tell the soldiers to leave the water alone." That was all. Simple words that were heavier than any written report. At 0730, I filed my statement at the makeshift command post. I wrote down times: 0207 departure, 0215 first breath on the channel, 0219 tracks, 0223 signal interference that carried the breathing, 0227 trailer taken, 0229 comms dead, 0235 arrival at staging field. Reported the physical details: plate-sized prints with 3 gouges, the reflective eyes, scales. Described the smell: metallic and ancient. I wrote down the dog's reaction, the handler's observations, the civilian's warning. A copy went into the unit log. Somewhere in the official chain, a line clerk would paste "wildlife incident" into a typed field and watch the story fold into precedent. We were told to keep operational security, not in the sense of national security, mind you, no rocket science lines of redaction, but in the sense that the county and the agency types wanted the event controlled. Informal caution, they called it when speaking to the lieutenant on the phone. The man who introduced himself only as Parker told us without malice that rumors were dangerous in small towns after evacuations. He looked at each of us like a sleep doctor might look at a group of insomniacs, not unkind but intent on preventing a contagion. Those first 12 hours are the part of this story that split me from what might have been. On the one hand, the documentation and recovery efforts were standard: inventories, statements, repeated radio checks. On the other, there was a sliding scale of oddities, an absence of debris, the way the radio carried the breath, the way the prints were 3-toed and clean as a photograph, and the sense that the formal process would not necessarily preserve them. I felt that tension in my chest like a lever. And that's the part that stays with you. Not the official report, not the formal log, not the county's neat phrase that would later slide across pages as weather-induced loss. It's smaller things: the way the dog wouldn't leave its handler, the shape of the prints before the water ate them, the metallic taste that lingered for hours on my tongue. Those are the things that proof you, the witness, against an easy resolution. We stayed at the staging area for the rest of the morning, running checks, replenishing packs, logging the civilians who wanted to go on to the county shelter. The recovery team kept at the creek, probing, tossing out lines, checking downstream culverts. I sat in the back of a Humvee and watched men come and go like storm shadows. A few of them tried to joke about it, to reframe what happened into something they could stomach: lost gear, clever animals, faulty straps. Humor is a defense mechanism.
so is silence. At 1100, the lieutenant called a single-line unit briefing. He did it in a way seasoned leaders do. Short, factual, no editorializing. We leave everything with the recovery and county. No extra movement today. Document everything you saw. If anyone asks explicitly, refer them to the command post. Do not speculate. That's an order. He looked tired, but cleanly resolved. The men tightened, adjusted their belts, and knew what that meant. We do our job, and then we move on, until someone higher decides what to do with the odd pieces. I remember sitting with my back to the generator, the field lights humming a mechanical lullaby, and thinking about those eyes. For a second, time slowed, and the past and present rubbed together. A child I once knew who'd fallen into a river and been pulled out. A different theater of operations where we'd all been tested. All of them came back in that small, hard line. Eyes that study you. That night in the hollow, something had looked at us without panic. It had looked at us like we were objects to be measured. Before the first shift ended, the deputy county coordinator approached me and said quietly, "You boys were lucky. Only the trailer. Nobody hurt." He had the look of someone trying to close a ledger. I wanted to say that luck had very little to do with whether a 9-ton piece of steel slips into a current and vanishes. Instead, I said, "We'll be available for anything you need." He nodded and walked away, his boots pausing in a way that suggested he didn't really believe what he'd said. The men took turns staying awake and tense in the back of vehicles, watching the creek like someone watches a sleeping animal that might wake and be different. I stayed up for a while, pacing, thinking. The radio was dead on all the channels we tried. At one point I heard, distantly, through a borrowed frequency from a county repeater, a laughing voice say, "Must be coyotes." And I almost wanted to answer back that coyotes don't breathe like low pipes and don't pull trailers without a ripple. But I didn't. I kept watch like a soldier does. Quiet, alert, a kind of waiting. By the time the sun slid into the high trees and took the cold off the field, the recovery team had come back with gloves full of mud and little else.
They'd found a length of canvas strap snagged on a rock downstream, and one handle bent out of shape. They took photos, cataloged it, and wrapped it in a bag. It was careful work, the sort designed to make a messy world make sense again. They told us they would continue searching, but the tone of their voices, low, professional, told another story. Sometimes water takes things and hides them so well that even the best searchers are left with hypothesis and not proof. Later that afternoon, when the sun had dropped and the men of the unit were being debriefed in turns, a young private came up to me with his hands in his pockets and said, "Sarge, you think it was something deliberate?" His eyes were flat. He wanted to know whether to be afraid on nights by creeks for the rest of his life. I looked at the private. I saw a boy who'd only seen the world in training grounds, and who now had been given a piece of something that didn't fit his field manual. I said what I had to say, the honest part that's still bounded by uncertainty. "I don't know," I told him, "but respect the water, respect what people say about places, and when something doesn't fit, don't stand alone and try to prove it. Bring witnesses." He nodded like he'd been given a prayer. That night we were told to maintain radio silence except for formal check-ins. Men slept in shifts, the way you sleep when you don't trust the dark. I tried to let the events compress into a usable memory. Times, facts, the look of those prints. The more I tried to write it neat in my head, the less tidy it became. The eyes refused to be boxed into language. And once you've seen something look back like that, the quiet afterwards is a kind of companion. It sits in your ribcage. It follows you on details, an echo in a static line, a smell in the kitchen. I filed my official words and went to bed with them, but my mind kept returning to a detail the lieutenant had written down in his log: reflective eyes, scales, and an exhale across the channel that synchronized with our radios. We didn't know then what the recovery teams would find, what the county would call it, or whether higher authorities would step in. We didn't know if this would drift into local legend or into an unremarkable file someplace in a building stacked with reports. We were just soldiers doing our job, suddenly asking ourselves if our job had been to wake something that preferred to remain undisturbed. If you've ever felt watched by something near water, if you've had that small animal fear, leave a note in the comments. There's power in sharing what we've seen. I am not the kind of man who seeks headlines. I keep records because that's what we do. But some things don't lend themselves to neat reports. In the middle of that night, while men slept in the backs of trucks and the county worked the paperwork, we watched the creek as if it could answer questions. It did not.
The only answer we had was the space where the trailer had been, the sedate set of tracks that led into the water, and the memory of two eyes that returned our stare. We were all given orders to remain available for follow-up interviews. The official channels promised a recovery operation at first light. What I didn't know then, and what I would come to learn in the months after, was how quickly official versions press down hard on the edges of whatever falls outside their categories. How easy it is for a narrative to be smoothed into acceptability. How quickly the men who'd been there begin to be reassigned, or find themselves without a place comfortable enough to speak about that night. For now, we had what we had. Witnesses, a missing trailer, 3 toed prints, and radios that had carried breath like a living thing. We had a county trying to keep its people calm. We had an old man's story tucked into a pocket with someone else's official phrasing. We had the unit's log with times and the lieutenant's notes. And we had the memory of something very old and patient lifting its head out of the water and looking right at us. We secured our gear and stayed until the recovery team said they'd done all they could for the day. The men were quiet, each keeping those images in the compartments of their own minds. I'd like to tell you that I slept well that night. I didn't. I walked the perimeter until dawn, listening to the creek like it was a thing that would speak again. At daylight, the recovery team was back, and they took over the scene, wearing bright vests and cameras, asking for lists of witnesses. When they took my statement again, more formal this time, there were men there with no insignia I recognized. They asked their own questions, polite and precise, and I answered them as best I could. They suggested in oblique phrases that we shouldn't broadcast things that might alarm the public. Containment, they called it. I nodded because what else do you do when people with quiet aim and a formality of expression want to shape what the world will know? By the time I left the hollow, the water looked mostly indifferent. The railroad of leaves along the bank whispered. The prints were fading. The smell had retreated slightly, though I could still taste a metal edge at the back of my tongue. In my bag, I had a photocopy of the initial log and a small plastic evidence bag with a sliver of canvas. Men had joked at some point about the thing being a river monster out of a child's tale. People joked to keep their heads together. We drove back to base in the hush of men who'd seen something they couldn't file neatly. The lieutenant kept his eyes ahead, unbothered and watchful, a man of orders. I sat in the back and thought about the eyes. I thought about the way the radio had breathed.
The whole time I felt the slow gravity of an institution starting to fold the event into a report, and the faster human need not to let the story die as a line in a ledger. We had no answers, only questions, and that's where everything sat as we rolled back toward the lights of the base and away from the dark bend in the creek. We rolled back to base in a kind of weighted silence that didn't lift for days. The lieutenant filed the formal statement at 7:30, and the line clerk stamped it and passed it up. The county took possession of the scene. The recovery team bagged the strap and the handler's single scrap of canvas. Everyone did the things you do after contact: counting, cataloging, logging. The official language slid in quickly: weather-induced loss, wildlife activity, loss to current. Those words have a way of smoothing fright into acceptability. They thin things out until the edges are dull. Still, the unit held a private ledger. Men kept in their pockets the details they trusted less to a typed form: the taste of metal on the tongue for hours, the dog's whine that felt like a plea, the way the radio took on that deep inhale and carried it like a melody. The lieutenant asked for a witness list and a closed-room debrief. He sat with us and listened and wrote in neat script: reflective eyes, scales, breathing synchronized to radio static, plate-sized 3-toed impressions. He did his duty exactly as his oath demanded. He documented the material facts without editorializing. That made his notes the more important later on. Officers' logs have a habit of surviving later cuttings and filings. Around midday, 2 plain-clothed investigators showed up again. They'd been there at dawn. One introduced himself as Parker, the other as Miss Hale. Neither wore a uniform. Both carried small black cases and had an air about them like people whose job is to keep conversations tight and the world manageable. They asked for the radios. They wanted hard copies of the logs. They took photographs, but only the kind you use for evidence, not the kind you send to friends. Their questions were precise. Who spoke when? Who heard the breathing? Who saw the prints? They asked for names, times, and the detained radios. They suggested, softly, that speculation only hurts local morale. "We'll need these secured," Miss Hale said, turning over the handhelds with gloved hands. "Chain of custody. Thank you." She didn't say it as an order, but she didn't have to. The implication settled in our throats. Their presence was not a threat, and it was not reassurance either. It was a bureaucratic hand extending over the story. They were careful to couch things as procedural,
evidence collection, preservation, a need to control rumors in a fragile post-evacuation environment. Behind the politeness, though, you could see the edges of containment, forms to sign, statements to verify, a discreet recommendation that we keep the incident internal. It wasn't censorship.
It was the softer, institutional version of the same thing, an encouragement to let official channels carry the narrative. 2 days later, after the county's searches had finished for the day, the first formal report landed in our inboxes. No human casualties, it read. Trailer recorded as lost to water, no debris accounted for. Somewhere in the body of the report, a clerk had typed radio interference observed, but 1 line later, a supervisor had footnoted it as unconfirmed equipment issue, and that footnote was the kind of nudge that starts a thread toward normalcy. The record existed. The record also softened the night into tidy categories. That is how these things happen, through the accrual of language. People who read the report years later would see neat phrases. Those of us who had been there kept the smell in our mouths. The immediate tactical changes were simple and sensible. No unsanctioned patrols near the bend, extra lighting at the ford, a temporary hold on voluntary civilian crossings for the night. But at the human level, the splintering began. A private broke down 2 days after the event. Couldn't sleep, couldn't tune radios without hearing that inhale. His medic put him on light duty and recommended counseling. Green, the handler, transferred the dog temporarily out of the unit's care because neither dog nor man would settle. Another soldier, another quiet soul, requested reassignment, said the hollow made him think of things he couldn't shake. The lieutenant processed those requests with the same care he used to process after-action reports. Not punitive, but final. Men were moved, lives adjusted. Nothing dramatic, nothing sinister, just the small administrative steps that distance an incident from everyday life. I stayed, not because I had to, because the story would not leave me otherwise. I filed the official statement at 07:30 like the rest of them, dates, times, then kept a copy and wrote my own version at night by hand. There's an honesty to writing your own words that the typed record often lacks. I found I was returning to the same small things, the way the metal taste lingered, the way the radio static would sometimes resolve into something that sounded like breathing if I held the handset too close and let my mind do the rest. A week later, a package arrived at my mailbox. It wasn't from anyone local. It was from a number I recognized only because I'd served with him years earlier, Corporal Harris. Harris had been an intelligence analyst before he left the service. After the Guard, he kept odd hours, working as an independent researcher and doing contract FOIA work for journalists when he could. He sent me a short note. Saw the brief. I collect river incidents. Got time? I did. We met in a diner not far from the base. 2 old soldiers with coffee and the kind of talk that starts with weather and slides toward what we both had in our pockets. Harris put a folder on the table.
Inside were photocopies of small-town newspaper clippings, a typed list of incidents along Appalachian tributaries that had odd commonalities, unexplained equipment losses, accounts of strange lights, mention of interference on local radio repeaters, brief mentions of animal tracks unusual in sheriff's blotters. Some of the items were decades old, some were as recent as the previous year. Each entry had gaps, blacked-out lines, or references to pending inquiry. He kept careful notes on what was official and what was local rumor. "You get the sense of pattern?" Harris asked, leaning back. His voice had the same flat cadence he'd used while reading maps in the briefing room. It isn't just one trailer or one creek. He was right. The more I read those clippings, the more I saw a rhythm. Incidents clustered around creeks and eddies. Witness accounts described something that watched. Where people tried to record it, photos came back blurred or washed out. Radios picked up odd carrier noises. Animals vanished. Boats, trailers, livestock. Things that belonged to people were sometimes gone with almost no turbulence left behind. In several cases, the preliminary notes, when present, used the language of natural hazard or occurrence, and the deeper lines, those that might explain interference, were marked sensitive or left blank. Harris was methodical. He had an old laptop, a scanner, a knack for turning small-town archives into a cross-index. His tone never wandered into alarmism. He pointed out coincidences and then asked the right question. What would create interference on a carrier across multiple unconnected repeaters at the same time that something in the water inhaled like a living bellows? We began to talk in those hours like 2 men going over a map. The more we compared notes, the clearer the pattern. Harris had contacts, retired sheriffs, folks who worked at county dispatchers, people who'd been in the room when the radios went odd. He could call and get a recollection.
Sometimes that recollection came back with a hard date and a file number. Sometimes it came back as a story told over a cup of coffee at a diner in a town where the same creek had a different name. That was both useful and maddening. The same motions, different names. A month after the incident, I filed a FOIA request for comms logs through the public channel Harris recommended. The reply took months. When it came, some lines were blacked out, the kind of redaction that leaves your eye wondering what precisely they didn't want you to read. It was plausible enough, common practice to protect personal data, sensitive infrastructure, security protocols. But the thing about redactions is that they act like a finger tapping on a window. Your attention drifts to the darkened space.
What we learned from those fragments was small and particular, spiking interference at specific times, notation in one log that a frequency was experiencing recurring anomalous carrier noise, source unknown. There was nothing explosive in the release, only hints and a pattern under the proper lens. Around that time, a local woman, Mrs. Wilkes if I remember correctly, contacted Harris. She'd heard his name through mutual acquaintances and wanted to talk. We'd seen her at the staging field, an elder who slipped away before dawn and left a note. Tell the soldiers to leave the water alone. Harris set up a meeting in her parlor. She had the hands of a woman who'd worked with quilts and tobacco and river grasses. She had eyes that were patient and small lines scored by weather and time. You boys should not have been there, she said simply when we sat. She told us the stories you'd expect, and then the ones you didn't. The croon of an old lullaby that warned children away from a bend, log entries from a 1930s ledger noting boat lost in eddy, and a sketch in an old family Bible of a rounded head with mirrored eyes. She used the old names, Hollow Keeper, Eddy Folk, names that were both affectionate and grave. People don't say the same things in the same way by accident, Harris said later. Or they do, but you don't get the same pattern. I took that as validation and as a warning. Folklore often encodes practical advice. Stay away from thin ice. Do not anchor near quicksand. Respect the current. Sometimes it also warns about things that are older than policy. That old, felt knowledge had saved lives for generations in small, quiet ways. The night we had been ordered to shepherd families out to the road, that lore had existed in parallel with command channels. We had not known until we stepped into the hollow that the two would come into conflict. The months after weren't dramatic in public, but they were active in quieter seams. Harris kept compiling. I kept giving him what I had: times, radio logs, my handwritten note with the lieutenant's exact phrasing about reflective eyes. He introduced me to a handful of other witnesses: boatmen who'd lost a motor to a place called the Red Eddy, a sheriff who'd pulled up a file with a notation about losses near Indefinido Creek, and a woman who swore she'd seen a large, scaled head glide across moonlight and had been scoffed at in her town until another family came forward. We met in hotel conference rooms and church basements, a small network of people rebuilding a chain of events from rumor and fragment. There was a kind of modest courage in those meetings, honest witness, not spectacle, men and women who had seen something that didn't conform to a checklist, offering their memories as fact and being treated like the fragile blank page they could be. At one of those meetings, a man named Don, retired from County Dispatch, brought a cassette. He'd been in the booth the night the interference hit.
He recorded radio calls for training purposes and had kept old tapes that nobody else had thought to catalog. He brought a portable player and, humbly, he pressed play. The hiss of wind, a dispatcher's voice. Then, under the carrier like a low organ, a breath. The room went still. No one spoke for a long minute. We all felt the hairs on our arms rise in the same way they had that night in the hollow. "You can call it what you like," Don said finally, "but I know what I heard." He set the cassette on the table like an offering. "I don't know if anything in this sheet has an answer, but it's a thing that happens." We tried to get the tapes into public hands. We tried to share them with a reporter who had interest but not time, who told us our anecdotes would not make the cut for the paper's headlines. We tried to post material online. Each time a larger, more formal channel assumed responsibility, the material thinned. Photos that were once sharp cropped into shapes, audio slowed and scrubbed, comments redacted. There were administrative pressures too. A few men who pushed for more public transparency found their careers slowed. One lieutenant who'd volunteered to be outspoken on civilian calls was suddenly assigned to a long-term domestic logistics project and told, politely, that deployment windows were being adjusted. No one threatened him, but the momentum of an ordinary working life has ways of flattening what a bark can raise.
I could not bring myself to do that. Not because I had a particular desire for spotlight, but because the memory had teeth. The eyes had teeth. For months I slept badly. Sometimes, out of nowhere, I'd hear the same inhale through a TV speaker when a channel returned to static. It was a small human failing, associative memory, but it was real. Water in a gutter could make me breathe like a man running. I became careful around my own kids' swim lessons. I would not go near the deep end of a community pool, not because I thought the creature could step off the pool liner into chlorinated water, but because the sense of being watched had nested itself into my chest. The mimetic part of trauma is not rational. Years passed. Harris kept compiling. He found a pattern that grew less like a scatterplot and more like a line. These incidents were rare, but they were not unique. He collected a dozen accounts with matching motifs: reflective eyes, interference on radio, three-toed or long-fingered tracks, sudden loss of heavy objects to eddies, and the thin line of folklore in each community. He made a small redacted packet and took it to a small conference in 2006 on anomalous hydrological incidents, an academic meeting with half-interested scientists and the other half being people devoted to documenting oddities. We were not trying to create sensationalism. We were trying to ask hard questions. What mechanism could produce interference on a carrier and at the same moment inhale like a living engine?
What could move tons without turbulence? No one offered definitive answers. The consensus was politely skeptical and professionally curious. Then the institutional walls flexed again. Shortly after the conference, a notice came through the Guard's admin channels about better control of external communications concerning ongoing multi-agency incidents. It was natural language until you parsed it. Then it was a formal way of nudging behavior. A man I knew, quiet, earnest, who'd been trying to publish a small paper about radio anomalies, found his namesake projects reassigned or delayed. Nobody called it punishment. It looked like routine admin, but narrative friction does not often vanish without bureaucratic weight. That said, Harris and I kept at it. We did what we could within the law: FOIA requests, interviews, careful corroboration. We did not ambush anyone or trespass into private property. We asked permission when we could. Once in late summer of 2007, we went back to the hollow where the trailer had been taken. It returned in my dreams frequently, a place more a scar than a sight. We drove quietly in daylight, Harris with a digital recorder and a photographer named Elise who wanted to capture the bank with a telephoto to show patterns in the mud. The bank looked smaller in daylight than memory had made it. Sun softened the menace, but the hollowness remained, an eddy with a particular color to it, an old dark that didn't quite reflect the sunlight the way surrounding water did. We took photos. We walked the bank. The mud still bore faint impressions that matched the descriptions I'd written, plate-like impressions and small drag marks, but months of rain and human interference had done their work. The prints were quieter than memory, but when the light hit the bank at the right angle, you could see the echoes. A local man who owned a small bait shop, nameplate on the window bent with weather, came down and watched us. He didn't ask for our credentials, but eyed our gear. "You boys with the paper?" he asked. I told him we were just documenting. He spit and said, "My brother lost a skiff in that eddy in '91, swore the water didn't ripple." He told us a story about his brother hearing a noise on his CB the night before, a hum overlaying the channel that he couldn't trace. The man wore a face of someone who had made peace with the not knowing of things. He shrugged and said, "The river keeps its own counsel." We went back with respect. We paid for coffee in town and left a donation at the bait shop. We didn't leave with anything conclusive. We left with a sense reinforced that the place had a history, and that history was not reducible to a phrase. Time, too, did not treat the men of that platoon equally. Some moved on, some moved away, a few carried the detail close to the chest. The lieutenant, steady, practical, retired a few years later and settled into a quieter job. We corresponded now and then.
The private who couldn't sleep took up a trade that kept him away from streams. Green found another canine job with a search and rescue nonprofit. The dog never quite let go of the memory of that night. I learned to live with the static, like a scar. There were nights when the breathing would return, purely in my imagination. I'd be in a hardware store, standing under fluorescent lights, and a particular hum from an electric motor somewhere in the building would press into my ribs. Once, late at night, the cheap scanner I kept in the truck, old habit, picked up a carrier with a low, long inhale threaded inside it. I froze. I listened till the faint sound dissolved into static. I know what a man does when he hears something he can't make sense of in the middle of a cold night. He gets quiet and holds on to what he knows. For me, what I knew was small and stubborn. Times, tracks, radios that behaved like living things, and the look of those eyes. Years on, Harris sent me an email with a subject line that was both blunt and gentle.
pattern documents ready, maybe publish. He'd organized interviews, copies of local blotters, and some of the tapes Dawn had shown. He'd redacted things where needed and prepared a careful packet. He wanted to put it on an open site, not for sensational clicks, but to create a repository for witness accounts. We did it cautiously. We anonymized where people wanted anonymity. We posted links to the clippings and to audio where permissions allowed. It wasn't a major splash. It was a small, stubborn pebble into a long, slow pool. Once the packet was public, something interesting happened. A woman in Ohio emailed with a short note. My uncle saw something in the Muskingum in '79. A retired tugboat captain wrote at length about a night he'd had interference on his VHF and a moment where his binnacle light caught a reflection like a mirror. They weren't dramatic. They were small, precise, and they fit the shape we had sketched. Each was an ordinary human account that pushed the pattern a little wider. There were also backlash and cautions. A media outlet called for a quick take. We declined. Harris and I both knew that curiosity and amplification can become a pressurized thing, one that attracts people who are more eager for sensation than for careful testimony. We also felt a responsibility to the men who had been there that night. A story can make a man a spectacle in a way that does the suffering no good. In 2012, early in the spring, I got a call from an old friend, a former lieutenant named Maldonado who'd gone into county emergency management. He'd read the packet and wanted to ask a favor. He was running a training day for emergency responders about dealing with unusual environmental hazards and needed someone who'd been on the ground to talk about chain of command, preserving evidence, and maintaining calm. I said yes.
I spoke for an hour in a classroom of eager, sober men and women who wanted to learn not just tactics, but a humility that comes from the unknown. At the end of the talk, a woman in the back approached me and said quietly, "My brother disappeared on the Ohio branch in '88. It was a freak flood," they said. Her hands were shaking. She wanted to know if we could help. I passed her Harris's email. That is how the chain kept growing, small exchanges across years. Harris and I were not investigators in any official sense. We were consolidators of witness experience. We created space where people could tell their stories without being dismissed or made into entertainment. The cost, in a personal sense, came down to small things. I stopped keeping the car parked near deep water if I could avoid it. I kept my hand on the door handle in unfamiliar riverside towns. Thunderstorms made my chest tighter in a way they didn't before. I have friends who can switch their minds off. I am not one of them. Memory has a way of being faithful where facts sometimes fail. The eyes had not left me. Sometimes at night I would wake and the TV would be on a static channel, and for a heartbeat I'd hear the inhale. Other times I would pass a creek, and a child's bright float would remind me of the trailer we lost, and of the old, gentle cruelty of water that has its own secret laws. There is one story I have not told much, partly out of embarrassment and partly out of fear. 2 years after the event, I went to the county office under the pretense of filing an additional statement. I wanted to see what the recovery team had written up in full and to ask for copies of the photos they had taken. The clerk at the desk, 30, polite, a person who'd never seen the old ways of a hollow, went to the back and came back with a slim manila folder. He handed it to me with a careful thumb. "It's all the recovery stuff," he said. "You can photocopy what you want." I paged through. Photos were grainy and gray. The bank had been documented in the morning light, and it had the kind of sterile clarity that wins courtrooms but confuses memory. There were notes, there were times. There was one line in an initial dispatch that had been redacted in ink. My name sat near the bottom of a witness list. I filed copies, paid for them, and left. On the way home, I opened the mirror of the visor and saw my face go thin in the reflection. I remember thinking, as any reasonable man might, how small a file this could become, how neat a thing for a clerk to shelve. I also remember thinking that smallness did not mean unimportance. Evidence is not only the body. Evidence is also memory and testimony, and the way small communities remember to warn one another. We reached a point where I stopped expecting definitive answers. That was not defeat. It was realism. There are things that happen in the world that have pattern but no tidy taxonomy.
The creature, if it was a creature, kept its motives close. It took without flourish and left few traces. The institutional response, at times, rubbed like a hand over a scab, necessary for order, but smoothing what matters into a comfortable script. That rub is not necessarily malicious, one another to be careful around old bends. I kept seeing my comrades in different jackets in different seasons. We met for a beer now and then, and spoke in the compressed language soldiers use. Facts only, no embellishment. Then a long silence. The lieutenant would sometimes laugh quietly over something trivial, and then the mood would drop. we'd all feel the same thing, that whatever it was had left a gentle shadow on our lives. People sometimes ask if I think the men who came to collect the radios were officials in some dark sense. I answer them the way any pragmatic man would. They had the manner of people whose jobs were to make certain stories small and manageable. They had credentials that could be verified as belonging to a state-level investigative team in some iterations. I saw no forced threats, no overt malice, only process. And processes are neutral until they are not. They will archive, they will appoint, they will delay, and they will classify. That is the way institutions protect the public and themselves both. Whether that protection comes at the cost of inconvenient truths is a question for someone else. In the end, the thing that never left me was the way those eyes reflected light, mirror-like, insistent, and patient. They were not hungry in the way a starved animal looked. They were watching with a calculation that felt older than our language for calculation. That has become a kind of moral crease for me. We, as a people, sometimes forget to let local knowledge shape our behavior. We assume the best of mechanisms, engineering, policy, plans, and forget that an elder's caution can come from decades of small, practical observation. That night in the hollow, there had been a man who said, "You boys should leave the water be." He was not a fool. He was an accumulation of experience. We treated him politely. We still did our job, but the river took what it took. If any hard certainty remains, it is this. If you work in places where water runs deep and moves slowly, listen, not as a superstition, but as a matter of prudence. Take local witnesses seriously. Record your observations. Bring more than one witness. And if you happen to hear something on the carrier that doesn't make sense, document it. Write it down in the way an officer writes times and positions. 0215, inhale on channel. 0219, plate-sized prints. 0227, trailer lost. 0229, comms drop. These are small facts that knit into a pattern if you have the patience to look.
There are people who asked me, in the years after, whether I thought that whatever we'd seen was intelligent, territorial, a guardian, or a predator. My answer was careful, because the thing about eyewitness testimony is that it should be honest about its limits. It seemed aware. It tested the trailer as if tugging for a weight it was evaluating, not out of malice, but out of territorial logic. The local folk told stories of guardians that take what comes too close to the bank. Whether that was superstition or ecological memory, I can't say. For a soldier whose job is often to classify threats, that omission is uncomfortable. But ambiguity has a moral edge to it. It allows us to be cautious without being vicious. It allows us to say, keep records, listen to elders, respect the river. And it allows stories like this to be warnings rather than boogeymen. Don't camp near that bend after dark. Don't trust a calm surface. Keep your radios charged and report odd interference. There is a last thing I should say about how the experience shaped me. Years later, at a small public event where Harris and I were invited to speak about the human side of emergency response, I met the niece of one of the civilians we'd evacuated the night of the incident. She was in her 20s and had grown up with those old fears in the edges of family talk. She told me quietly that the episode had become a small constancy in family lore, a place at which the adult world had once been surprised, and a story told to children about obedience and respect. That's the thing, she said. My mama used to tell me not to go near that part of the creek. I never knew why she was stern about it until later. She just said, the water remembers. She smiled, but there was a steadying look in her eyes that taught me something I already had been learning slowly. Memory, personal, familial, communal, carries a kind of practical intelligence that formal reports sometimes underestimate. I tell you this because the thing we stumbled on that night in April of 2002 did not vanish in the neatness of logbooks. It persisted as rumor in kitchen chairs, as an old man's note tucked into a dispatch, as a tape in a retired dispatcher's box, as a redacted line in a county file. It persisted in the men who couldn't sleep, and in the man who refused reassignment because he needed to keep a hand on the story until someone else would hold it too. If you work near water, or travel near old eddies and river bends, keep your ears open and your records cleaner than I kept mine that first week. Take pictures, note the times, get names, and keep copies away from the neat hands that file reports into comforting phrases. There are people like Harris who will listen, corroborate, and collect. There are also the elders who know things by the kind of fear that comes from lived experience. The two things together may be the only defense that helps the next person walking a riverbank at night.
I am one of the men who went down to that hollow at 0207 and watched a trailer be taken into the dark. I am one of the men who kept an officer's log and also kept an old piece of personal paper with the lieutenant's handwriting. I am one of the men who spent years taking FOIA replies and cassette tapes and elderly accounts and stitching them together into a map that says, softly, that these things recur. I do not know what the creature was. I do not pretend to offer a classification or a theory that pins it into science. All I can give you is a witness account, a list of times, and a warning. Tonight, if the wind is a certain way, and the static on a cheap scanner hums like an old pipe, I can still hear that long exhale threaded through the carrier. It is a sound I will never be able to forget. It taught me how thin the line can be between what we assume we control and what simply is. It taught me to keep a small caution in my pocket, to value local warnings, and to respect the way old places carry memory. If you want more documented eyewitness accounts and the compiled pattern files Harris and I put together, subscribe and check the description for the source links and our network contacts. And if you ever find yourself by a dark bend at night and the air tastes of iron, remember that sometimes it's better to turn the other way.